This is Father's Day, so I guess I should start with a Father's Day story. I was with my youngest daughter recently, who happens to be the mother of my grandchild, and is also the proverbial spitting image of me. Of the three children, she's the one that looks the most like her dad. And we were with a group of people, and she was introducing me to one of her friends, and she said, "This is my dad," and we shook hands, and immediately her friend looked at her and said, "You have your dad's eyes." And she kind of laughed and said, yeah, I do. And we kind of looked at each other and laughed. And the friend finally walked off. And I looked at my daughter and said, "So after 5 or 6 or 7 or 8,000 times of hearing that, is that getting old for you?" And she said, "No, not really, I don't mind." And we kind of laughed about it and went on. And this is what Matthew says. Jesus went about all the cities and villages teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. And when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and they were helpless and they were like sheep that did not have a shepherd. God sees life for what it is. I think if I had anything to say to my children today or to say to you and to your children, I would want to say at least this: God sees life for what it is. And I don't ever want anyone in this building or anyone outside of this building to think that God does not see and know all that is a part of your life. That God is not completely aware of what is going on in your life. God sees life for what it is, the best of it and the worst of it. God knows this. All you have to do is scour the Scriptures to get a sense of how intimately knowledgeable God is in our lives. In Genesis chapter 2, humans have only been on the planet for a few verses. And it says, "And God saw that the man was lonely." Completely aware of what was going on in Adam's life. Move to the next book in Exodus chapter 3, and many of you who know the story know that the Israelites have been in Egypt for about 400 years. And for most of those years, they have been well fed, they have been comfortable, they have been taken care of during a famine. But all of a sudden, a new Pharaoh arises in Egypt and enslaves the Israelites and oppresses the Israelites. And in Exodus chapter 3, God says to Moses, "I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cries. I know of their oppression. They've gained my attention. I see and know the world as it is." Most of you know that my favorite biblical book is the book of Ruth, and I love the character of Naomi. And Naomi has a tough life. Naomi loses her home because of a famine. Naomi loses her husband and both of her sons to death while she's in a foreign country. And as she's coming back to Bethlehem, her hometown, she says, "The Lord has forgotten me. The Lord has forsaken me." But by the end of the book, Naomi realizes, and she says, "The Lord saw my affliction and had favor on me." God sees life for what it is. I want everyone in the room to know that God sees life for what it is. You can move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you see the same thing. Jesus is in the synagogue and he sees a widow put her last 2 pennies in the offering plate, and he sees her poverty and he sees her devotion. He's walking through Jericho and he sees a tax collector up in a sycamore tree named Zacchaeus. He sees how the people treat Zacchaeus. He sees how curious Zacchaeus is. He sees potential in Zacchaeus that nobody else sees. He walks by the Sea of Galilee and he sees some fishermen who have boats and nets and fish. And he says to them, "I see what a great work ethic you have. I see how industrious you are. I see how wealthy you are with your nets and your fish and your boats. Why don't you come and work with me and let's do some kingdom work together rather than what you're doing?" Find a person in biblical literature, Old or New Testament, I will guarantee you God sees the world as it is. And it ought to be somewhat reassuring to us that God sees our world exactly as it is. All right, now you may be thinking to yourself, "Jim, that's all well and good, but I'm not sure that's the greatest news in the world. I'm not just interested in God seeing things, I'd prefer God do something about it. I'm not as much into seeing as I am the doing. If God knows everything about my personal world, if God knows about the context I'm living in and how difficult it is, then the good news would be that God would do something, not just see it. Which reminds me of, I think, my favorite Father's Day story. So a young elementary school student is told to write an essay about his father for Father's Day. And so he sits down and he writes and he turns it in. The teacher gets up to read it on the next day, on the Monday after Father's Day, and he wrote, "My dad could trek through the deepest forest. My dad is so strong he could swim across the deepest ocean. My dad is so strong he could climb the highest mountain. But usually he just takes out the trash." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is hard for us sometimes. God never promised us that God would heal every ail. And God never promised us that God would solve every problem. Our world is rife with problems. Our bodies are going to consistently be filled with ailments as we age and move through life. This is a part of the human fabric. This is a part of the human condition. This is a part of the way God set this world in motion. In fact, Jesus Christ himself, God in the flesh, experienced rejection and experienced sorrow and experienced pain and experienced death. Even Jesus did not get out of those things that a lot of us would hope that God would do something about and get us out of. But what God did promise us is that I will be with you always. And so Jesus looked at the crowd with compassion. It's a word that means to be with you caringly, to be with you intimately, to be with you with full knowledge, compassion. God said, I will be with you. I'm not going to heal every ail and solve every problem, but I will walk with you through the world that I am fully aware of as you walk through it. Now that's really good news, because that means that those of us who are ministers of God, and remember every member is a minister, right? That we don't have to go into the world and solve everybody's problems and heal everybody's aches either. That what we're really called to do is to go compassionately in the world and be with people. It's really the second part of this text. God sees the world as it is, but God calls the disciples to go into the world and see the world and move in the world the way God sees the world and moves in the world. Which doesn't mean go fix everything. It means to be with people where they are and love them passionately. So it says Jesus calls these 12 disciples. And he says, I want you to go now, and I want you to cure diseases and speak good news and liberate people. I don't know if you noticed this, but what Jesus told his disciples to do in Matthew chapter 10 was exactly what it said Jesus was doing in Matthew chapter 9. In Matthew chapter 9, it says, and Jesus looked with compassion on the crowd, and he went and he cured their diseases, and he liberated them from their difficulties, and he preached good news to them. And then he told his disciples, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go into the world, and I want you to cure their diseases and liberate them from the difficulties, and I want you to preach good news to them. I want you to move in the world and see the world exactly the way I see and move in the world. See people and treat people the way I treat people. Do you remember that new commandment Jesus gave his disciples? Remember, the old commandment was love your neighbor as yourself. You remember that? The new commandment was, love one another as I have loved you. We don't always love ourselves too well. So Jesus gave them a new commandment. Don't love your neighbor as you love yourself, because you don't even do that very well. I want you to love your neighbor as I have loved you. See them and treat them as I would see them and treat them. Many of you know about Thomas Merton's real conversion. Thomas Merton was a monk at Gethsemane monastery in Kentucky. He entered the monastery in 1941, but it wasn't until 1958 that he was standing at the corner of Walnut Street and 4th Street in downtown Louisville, right in the middle of a shopping district, and looked out at the crowds who were walking by, and he said all of a sudden it hit him that these were all children of God. These were all his brothers and sisters. These were all people who were valued in the eyes of God, and he said, for the first time in his life, he knew what it was like to love everyone around him. He said he'd been a monk since 1941, but he was a different kind of monk and a different kind of Christian and a different kind of minister after that one day on a street corner in Louisville, Kentucky in 1958. Which reminds me of another monk. There's a young monk who was walking with his abbot one morning as the sun was rising and asked very philosophically, how do we know the moment that a new day has dawned? I mean, I see the sun coming up, but how do I know the moment that a new day has dawned? Is it when there's enough light for me to see a tree in the distance and know it's a tree? And the old monk said, no, that's not it. He said, well, is it enough when there's enough light to see a deer in the distance and know that it's a deer? And the old monk said, no, that's not it. And he said, well, when is it? And the father, the abbot, said to the young monk, it's when there's enough light for you to see a person in the distance and know that it's your brother or your sister. That's when a new day has dawned. God sees the world as it is. And the call for Jesus' disciples is for us to go into the world and see it the way God sees it and move in it the way that God moves in it. It was Teresa of Avila, from Spain, later granted sainthood by the church, who wrote these words that have become part of song and sermon through the years. She wrote, Christ has no body now but yours in this world. Yours are the hands with which he blesses. Yours are the feet with which he goes to do good. Yours are the eyes with which God sees with compassion. Christ has no body now in the world but yours. You are his hands. You are his feet. You are his eyes. So Jesus tells the disciples in Matthew chapter 10, I want you to go into the world and love it like I love it, see it like I see it, treat it the way I treat it. And if along the way somebody says to you, you know, you have eyes like your Father, well, I hope you never get tired of hearing that. Let's pray together. Loving God, you have looked compassionately on each of us. We have gained your grace and paid nothing for it. May we be in your world with your eyes, seeing the world as you see it, loving the world as you love it, giving grace with no expectation of payment. In Christ's name, but for our sakes. Amen.